This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with authors Mitchel Sollenberger and Mark Rozell their new book, The President's Czars, Undermining Congress and the Constitution. Mitchel Sollenberger is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Michigan Dearborn and is also the author of Judicial Appointments and Democratic Controls and The President Shall Nominate, How Congress Trumps Executive Power. Mark Rozell is professor of public policy at the George Mason School of Public Policy, and he has authored and edited numerous books on the American presidency, including Religion and the American Presidency, co-edited with Gleaves Whitney, and Executive Privilege, Presidential Power, Secrecy, and Accountability. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, when we talk about czars, and your book is about this governing phenomenon in the executive branch, how do we know what a czar is, and what do they do, and how are they different from, say, White House advisors, agency heads, department secretaries, etc.?
Well, I think it's the power that they exercise, that they're, and fundamentally that's where we peg our definition. So it centers around the significant power that they're exercising either through regulatory actions, decisions that bind and control not only government actors but also the private sector. And then the key second part is that the Senate does not confirm them, so the president is solely appointing them to these positions of power.
And also, many of these positions lack any statutory authorization at all. What we found in our research is that many of the so-called czars seem to be just made up out of thin air positions that presidents created in order to meet some perceived need to manage programs, to engage in regulation of private industries, or to authorize federal spending for a variety of areas. And we argue ultimately that it's a rather disturbing position constitutionally because you don't have the normal democratic controls attached to these positions, and that's what makes them different from a variety of other executive branch positions that require Senate confirmation, for example, or where officials are appointed who have merely advisory authority but no policy-oriented regulatory or budgetary authority. So what makes the czars distinctive is their lack of Senate confirmation, a lack of any normal set of democratic controls on the powers that they exercise, including being required to testify on the Hill. Presidents on occasion have even given joint positions, putting officials both in advisory positions on the White House staff and labeling them czars at the same time, and using the former position to shield them from congressional testimony, even though they are exercising an enormous amount of policy and budgetary authority in their other defined positions. So we find that this is constitutionally disturbing, and that's what distinguishes these officials from what we would call more legitimate positions in the executive branch where democratic controls still apply.
So on the dual appointment role you mentioned, so basically I could appoint someone without authorization to exercise significant policymaking, binding authority, but also as a White House advisor would be their second role. I can shield them through claims of executive privilege. Is that what you were saying, Mark?
Well, that's correct, and that actually has happened. And that's another one of the disturbing aspects of these positions is that these individuals who are not Senate confirmed, they are not subject to testimony, they can be protected by executive privilege, and yet they are exercising, in some cases, some of the most significant policy and regulatory powers of anybody in the executive branch of the government. And we argue that this is wrong, that the American Constitution was not established to provide for these types of positions that avoid democratic controls.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think it's important to note that our book does go through the history of this problem or issue, and it's a relatively recent phenomenon in the sense that in the early 20th century you see presidents like Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt creating more of these czars, and they're doing so through emergency measures. You know, the Overman Act, the first War Powers Act, and you see some ebb and flow through the 20th century. But again, as Mark said, it's when the czars are created whenever a president sees benefit in them.
And I know it seems that we are answering this question already, but it's one that I wanted to ask you, and I wanted to be specific about it. And I'll really direct this question to both of you gentlemen. What is the greatest threat represented by this type of executive power practice?
Mitch, you want to take the lead on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the absence of representative government. When you have Congress basically isolated from not only the decisions made by these czars, but the actual creation of the czar positions themselves, and again, this is through a lot of just deliberative action by lawmakers themselves, where they've ceded control over seemingly legislative responsibilities to the executive branch, and that's not just the president. It's department heads. It's lower level officials as well. The amount of deference that members of Congress have given these officials, I think, we describe at one point during the Roosevelt period where one czar was actually treated kind of like a rock star at a committee hearing meeting, and it's that kind of deference that you see time and time again, especially under emergency conditions. And as history has shown, presidents and the executive branch are not apt to cede power once they get it.
Yeah, Mark, kind of following on that question, another one, it seems, as I was reading the book, it seemed that Congress, on several occasions, and maybe significant occasions as well, a president will appoint a czar, and then Congress will then step forward at a later date after some sort of internal bickering, interbranch confrontation, will actually legitimate the practice in some way by appointing or creating the office or the agency, providing funds for what the czar was doing, et cetera. And that, in a way, you say, okay, so it gets legitimated through the branches working it out in a political process. But then the more you think about it, actually it's not legitimated. It's actually what you have: executive-dominated, executive-led government, which seems to be very contrary to the setup of the Constitution, the structural division of powers in the Constitution. Have you thought about that question and how these claims have been worked out?
Yeah, we definitely have thought about that question, and we expanded on it somewhat in the book, especially in the conclusion when we talked about various reforms we would like for Congress to initiate to overcome the problem of czars constitutionally. But the problem, as you know, historically, particularly in the modern era, is that Congress has not been a terribly good self-advocate. It has not protected its own constitutional-based powers at the hands of aggressive presidents who have tried to expand the reach and authority of the presidency whenever they are able to get away with doing so. And oftentimes, as in the case with czars, what appears to have utility is accepted by Congress. Presidents can make the argument, and defenders of czars have certainly done so, that the czar position does offer some utility to the executive branch and to the federal government. It enables presidents to coordinate complicated policies across multiple agencies. It's much more efficient to be able to get these people in place without Senate confirmation. It's much easier for them to do their jobs as they see fit or as the president wants them to, without having to appear before Congress to justify their actions. Now, we make the argument ultimately that just because something has utility, that doesn't make it constitutional or right. The constitutional framers put into place a complicated system of separated powers where each branch is supposed to vigorously defend its own powers and prerogatives against encroachments by another branch of government. And in the case of czars, we see, much like with the war powers and a variety of other presidential powers that are routinely being exercised these days, Congress has not done a good job of protecting itself, and oftentimes Congress has in effect, co-conspired with the executive branch to allow for a vastly expanded executive power in a variety of areas.
I think that's right, and to get to try to answer your question directly in terms of Congress validating through subsequent legislation these presidentially created czars, I'll give you one case in point where it's not necessarily that they're validating. In a sense, I can see where that is a term of art where you would use it, because they create this government structure that kind of looks like the czar a president created. So under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he's trying to meet the needs of war. He creates the Office of War Mobilization, and this is really trying to ump the production capacity of the U.S., particularly with war goods or munition, all those things that the troops need. And this is he creates this office, and members of Congress at the tail end of the war, around 44, they become concerned with the lack of accountability. I mean, because this office, the office holder was actually considered as the second president, if you will, and they created statutory structure for it. So it was renamed. It was the Office of War Mobilization. It was renamed the Office of War Mobilization and Reconversion, and then it was given several checks or democratic controls placed on this new government structure. Well, first was it had to be Senate confirmed. Before, Roosevelt just appointed this person solely on his own. Second, there was reporting requirements in terms of reports that were supposed to be given to Congress. It stipulated in the legislation that the director couldn't delegate his authority to issue orders, regulations to others, which was the problem under Roosevelt, where Roosevelt would create czars, and then his czars would create other czars. I mean, it was an administrative nightmare to try to figure out what Roosevelt was doing. And we're not the first to document this under Roosevelt, that he created positions for competing interests, yada, yada. I mean, this wasn't just in the White House. He was doing this in departments and agencies. So his kind of policy of creative destruction, if you will, or creative administrative management, we also looked at whether it worked or not. I mean, we didn't do a systematic study because our primary task wasn't necessarily to do that, but production didn't go up when he created this Office of War Mobilization and his other czars. So the utility of these czars that Roosevelt created wasn't necessarily there. So that was the point I wanted to make about validating, Congress validating. It wasn't necessarily validating as so much as placing these controls on administrative structure.
This kind of leads into something that both of you start with in the book, which is the understanding of separation of powers and executive power in the founding period. And this is, of course, articulated most succinctly by Publius in the Federalist Papers, which you guys nicely moved through the book on that account. But talk about, because there had to be, before the czars become popular, becomes possible, becomes seen as necessity by the president to appoint these men into power, there has to be a revolution of ideas, I think, thinking about executive power, thinking about separation of powers, and really rejecting the notion that Publius articulated of auxiliary precautions and building a constitution on the people, so that's its basis, but yet also hedging and protecting against sort of the tumults and the energy that one might get from time to time. Lay that out for me, if you will, and Mitch, if you could do that, that would be great.
Yeah, we do that in the book, and we discuss the progressive era and its rejection of many of the elements of checks and balances, separate branches sharing power, and really a move from a focus on legislative dominated government, if you will, in the 19th century to more presidentially centered government, where there was a trust in executive power, and you not only see that during the progressive era, you actually see it about 20, 30 years before, at the start of the civil service reform movement, right after the Civil War. Lincoln's assassinated, and you get all these civil service reformers in Congress who believe that Congress is the problem, the patronage system created. So really the progressives are piggybacking off of that, where the Pendleton Act of 1883 was passed, and really that pushed the patronage out of the government structure. We're no longer members of Congress. We're supposed to have a say in the appointment of department heads, of people in the states and the localities, and you go from there to the progressive era, where again, Woodrow Wilson comes to power, and Woodrow Wilson, as a progressive, believes in executive-centered government and believes that the legislative branch either functions too slowly, it can't do what it needs to be done in order to reform the economy, society, and so Wilson does just that. And his first opportunity is during World War I, and the passage of the Overman Act. Congress passes this law that gives a tremendous amount of power, more than any Congress before had given a president, and Wilson uses it effectively and uses it in creative ways to really establish these first domestic czars.
I want to. So you mentioned Woodrow Wilson, and also there's Theodore Roosevelt as well, and the idea consent of the governed does not come through Congress, through the representative branch. It actually can be seen as legitimated by the executive himself. That's a change.
It's a profound change.
Yes. But you see, because I want to talk about, you mentioned two men in particular, and I think if I remember correctly, you said they're the first two significant policymaking czars, Bernard Baruch and George Creel.
Yes.
And they're appointed by Woodrow Wilson in connection with the American effort in World War I. So automatically it's wartime, and as so many people have written about, war can be seen as the health of the state, and inaugurates new powers. We actually start to go off road, as it were, to seek new avenues of exercising government power. And so they wield this enormous power. But talk about these men and what they were appointed by Wilson to do, and what they actually achieved in almost a revolutionary fashion, it seems.
Well, I think what they achieved, and let's just talk. I'll talk about Bernard Baruch first, and I mean, actually, his name is on one of NYU's colleges, the Baruch College. And that's the same guy. He's a Wall Street financer. He's one of these dollar men guys, and it's a reference to basically his salary was $1 a year. And he comes into the Wilson administration as the head of the War Industries Board. And the War Industries Board is created through the Overman Act. And the Overman Act really only allowed for Congress, permitted through the Overman Act for the president to move around government structure and powers, not to create new government structure, not to create new powers. And the War Industries Board, Baruch's outfit, really does more than what Congress even delegated. So he's trying to do what I said before with Roosevelt's Office of War Mobilization, which is increase the production for the World War I for the U.S. soldiers in World War I, and he does a lot of different things to push the envelope of what had been done before. First of all, he's not Senate confirmed. There's no checks on him. He's purely a creature of the executive branch, and unlike the Roosevelt czars, we're not even quite sure where in the government structure he was. I mean, there was no executive office of the president. There was none of this White House office. So the formalized structure that you kind of see being grafted onto the presidency after the Reorganization Act of 1939, you don't have that yet with Wilson. So that even makes it even more problematic because, well, there's no reporting requirements. At least under Title III, the president has to report what's in the executive office of the president. So anyways, Baruch is trying to pressure different companies to take on different production priorities. He's using his association with Wilson, but also the power gleaned from his position on the War Industries Board to really increase the production. And we consider him to be probably the most powerful domestic czar in the history of the United States. I don't think there's much question of that. At the end of World War I mean, he had these grand ideas of creating service uniforms, one's shoe style. I mean, there was just stuff that was coming out of his office that Congress was like, my Lord, what did we create? And that's one of the reasons they didn't extend his authority, which is something he requested. He wanted this emergency office to continue in peacetime, and Congress, at least at that time, wasn't going to have it. They did later on. In World War II, they extended the Office of War Mobilization, and that carried on for decades later. And obviously that had to do with the Cold War and things like that. But the other person you mentioned was George Creel. He was the head of the Committee of Public Information. And technically, he wasn't supposed to have the same powers Baruch. This committee was actually a committee of different department heads. And in essence, the department heads didn't have anything to do with it, and Creel was allowed to run as however he wanted to. Creel's a former newspaperman, and he runs it in a way that he creates basically an office of censorship. It's oftentimes called the Creel Committee. He gets newspapers to not print certain things. He's getting newspapers to print damning things about the Germans. That's one of the reasons why you have a lot of this anti-German feeling in World War I, is because, well, the U.S. government was pushing it. They understood that Germany was the enemy, and they wanted the American people to feel the same way. So you see some of this on a smaller scale in World War II, but not to the same extent. Actually, what happens in World War II is Roosevelt, as he's apt to do, he divides the power of the Committee on Public Information, the Creel Committee, to two different agencies. So it's not necessarily as powerful as the Creel Committee. That's why one of the reasons why the Creel Committee is studied with such interest is because it was able to run so roughshod around the media, First Amendment rights, things like that.
I just want to back up and highlight something that I remember reading this book, and you've brought it to attention again. So Bernard Baruch, appointed by Woodrow Wilson for war mobilization purposes, ends in articulating that he should be able to size shoes for the American people, and also we should wear, was that correct, civilian service uniforms. And also you mentioned in the book with regard to Creel, which is incredible if you think about it. It's astounding. Creel, did you say he formed kind of a model, or was studied actually by the Nazi government? For propaganda purposes?
Yes, the Nazis liked what we were doing, what we did during World War I, and yes.
Well, I really would have liked to see the uniforms. They would have been great. I wanted to ask, and we've kind of talked about congressional pushback or the lack thereof, but I just want to ask a question. The president makes these appointments, it seems, for political purposes, administrative purposes, practical purposes. He can respond to his constituencies. And so I'm wondering, do we have evidence that these appointments actually accomplish presidential goals? And that's kind of an open-ended question. Do we have evidence that they've actually done something good as opposed to, and good as though, but instead of just kind of spinning their wheels, is it really more of a case of this being a political thing? And Mark, I don't know. That was a question I wanted to get out.
Well, I think it's more of a political show than anything else. It's an opportunity for a president to demonstrate in what appears to be a concrete way to constituencies that he is highlighting their issues and taking them seriously. So, for example, when President Obama decided that he was going to appoint a Chesapeake Bay czar, lots of advocates, interest organizations that actively are involved in the issue of wanting to clean up the Chesapeake Bay were very excited. And our research showed that no one spoke up against this as somehow an inappropriate power grab by the president, but rather various constituencies who care about the environment and want to see the president get very serious about this issue were all very complimentary to the fact that the president had appointed for them a czar. in their particular issue area. So it's really hard for Congress to engage in significant pushback when various organized constituencies out there are promoting the idea that we too want a czar for our issue, so the president showcases the importance of what we're doing, and then we can get more executive action on the issue. That's become the overriding mentality, I think, for many groups now, pushing for action by government to try to solve their problems. And if Congress doesn't have the backing of the American people on this issue, it's really hard, I think, to do something about it. Now, who's organized out there to oppose the presidential appointment of a Chesapeake Bay czar or a Great Lakes czar? I just don't see that there's an organized, active constituency that's heavily engaged in trying to stop the additions of all of these new czars all over the place. Now, have they made a policy difference? Have they created somehow better decisions in the executive branch than would have happened without them? Have they been able to manage resources better than could have happened without czars? I don't think so. I don't see any proof that czar positions have in any way improved government decision-making or improved the distribution of resources or made government more efficient. I think quite the opposite. It has added an additional layer to the executive branch, and it has caused, I think, a great deal of confusion with regard to who ultimately is responsible. When you have, for example, a climate change czar who is probably better known than the EPA administrator, and they have overlapping duties, and there is enormous confusion as to who's in control of a particular policy area, I think democratic accountability suffers, and I don't see any substantive improvement in government activity resulting from that type of arrangement.
In reference to the Chesapeake Bay czar, or the Asian Carp czar, the Great Lakes czar, which President Obama did appoint, where would the funds come from if this is totally statutorily unauthorized?
Well, there's the rub. Congress either would have to, after the fact, give authorization to these positions and appropriate funds for them, or the president would need to draw out funds from some other department or agency, which we argue, again, causes some very serious constitutional questions to arise about the propriety of doing so, since these positions, these czar positions, that is, don't have any constitutional basis, and they're not subject to Senate confirmation. So that's one of the significant problems we identify with the czar position, is that it's almost like the president making a complete end run around the legislative authorization and appropriations process. But again, as we point out, sometimes members of Congress consent to these arrangements, perhaps because they too believe that they can please a variety of constituencies by supporting the creation and the funding of a Chesapeake Bay czar, for example, who can be against cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay, of course. Again, constituency groups are thinking about the issue area and the seriousness to which they see the federal government attaching to their issue, and they're not thinking so much about separation of powers and constitutional issues and the precedents that are being created when presidents create all of these positions out of thin air and give them all kinds of responsibilities without constitutional controls.
I suppose so. We've kind of thought about an efficiency question and what might be achieved, but I guess the larger question really is the Constitution itself and what is lost. What do we lose by the president appointing these people outside of senatorial advisement and consent? Outside of any sort of vetting process, or people with counter agendas looking into these people and wondering, what do they really have the qualifications? Is this really a good idea? And that seems that's just gone.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I think an important point with that is that despite what presidents say, and you have presidents dating back, Johnson and even before him have have assumed they are the best ones or best positioned to know what is needed in the executive branch. But in actuality, what you have here is these people in the White House. The president himself is oftentimes not as experienced as members of Congress staff. Their White House staff aren't as experienced with executive governance or even what happens in federal government. So you have these people who might have been in the White House 6 months, a year, and they're talking about reorganizing this department, this agency, and that was probably one of the fundamental problems with the Reorganization Acts, which basically Congress delegated its authority to not only create but to reorganize, modify the federal government to the presidency, and really only took on a veto.
Which president would you be referring to there?
Well, we're talking at the start of the Roosevelt administration. First, you get the Reorganization Act of '39, but then subsequently the Congress, every few years or so, they had to reauthorize the authority, and then it went out, I think under Clinton in the early 90s is the last time a president had reorganization authority, so no president's had it since. But to tell you the truth, what's gone on since really the 70s, and this is with the 78 law, which is the White House Authorization Act. Then what Congress tried to do is actually push back against the executive branch and bring accountability to the White House, which really the law itself had the opposite effect. It gave the president much more discretion, and it allowed for even less reporting requirements. This is one of the tremendous problems we have with studying the White House and the executive office of the president, is that the president and his staff do not have to report much. I mean, we don't know what the chief of staff does, other than when we interview them and ask questions and get the papers years later. I mean, they don't have to have a yearly reporting on an executive branch flow chart or executive office of the president or White House office flow chart of who's been in there, how many people are there. Whenever you read these numbers, there's 500 people in the White House office, there's 5,000 people in the executive office of the president, that's guesswork. We don't know. I mean, because the law itself gives the president the ability to actually have 10,000 if he wants. These temporary appointments, they don't need to be reported under the law. So it's just it creates a troublesome obstacle for us to overcome with the studying of czars. And we say it in our book. This isn't a definitive list of czars. These are the only czars that we were able to figure out were czars. I actually think there's probably more White House czars than what we have. We're probably undercounting by a great deal.
Is the failure of Congress in this regard? I mean, Publius famously articulates in the Separation of Powers papers that you would connect the ambition of the man to the prerogatives of the office, to the branch, and so you would have a mutual effect of allowing his own ambition to protect that particular branch. And it seems this has failed with regard to Congress vis-a-vis the executive branch. Is the failure due to something like government has just become so big? Or is it something else?
Well, in part, it's government becoming so big, but also the vast shift in thinking about separation of powers that has occurred, especially in the modern era. Americans tend to look to presidents as potential saviors, and Americans, of course, tend to attribute the state of the economy, the well-being of the country, the success of this or that program, all to the president. And so we have evolved, I think, an understanding of governmental accountability that puts an enormous emphasis on the role of the president as the caretaker of the country, as the person ultimately responsible for the policy agenda and the well-being of the country overall. And so in that type of environment, sure, it's easy for presidents to flout constitutional forms by creating new czar positions, because that's a way for the president to showcase that he's in control, he's taking the lead, he understands he ultimately is responsible for the well-being of the country, and he's doing something that he believes is going to help solve a variety of complicated problems troubling the country. So, there has been a profound change, I think, in thinking about the roles of the branches in our system. And indeed, as you point out, the constitutional framers anticipated that members of each branch would jealously and vigorously defend their own powers and prerogatives whenever challenged by another branch that overreached its authority. Congress, over time, has done a miserable job in living up to that expectation of the constitutional founders. And this Czars issue is just one of many examples. We set out, by the way, to write a book on the unitary executive theory when we ended up writing a book on Czars. And we started looking at the Czars phenomenon, and we found out that there is just so much there that hasn't been fully explored that we just kept going with it. And a book ultimately came out of this, and now we have to get back to the broader question of the unitary executive theory, which is raised by the question you pose here.
Yeah, please do. I want to ask you. So, what types of harms have been caused? I mean, we've already discussed some. I mean, Baruch and Creel are exceptional, but practical harms. The Roosevelt administration. Of course. The narrative, at least with regard to executive power, that the popular one, which not together untrue, is you have the rise of the imperial presidency, which sort of culminates with Nixon, and then you have a circumstantial setback due to political forces under Ford and the Carter administrations, and then Reagan, it's argued revives to a certain extent this notion of executive power. But with the Czars itself and the use of the Czars, practical harms, I mean, we're able to identify horrible policy conclusions or results that have been reached.
Well, I think it's more subtle than just, perhaps horrible policy positions they've taken and implemented. It's more of the administrative flailing about by presidential administrations. I think one of the reasons why you can see unsuccessful presidential administrations or unsuccessful presidential policies is that they use these czars, or they create government structure, and it's to resolve a momentary issue. But they do so in a way where they're just flailing about for a solution without really sitting down and thinking about it. And that's one of the things I think our founding fathers had in mind with a Congress separate, a Congress, a president, separate branches, deliberation. Obviously, that's not happening in the modern era. I mean, to give you a case in point, I mean, you got Richard Nixon. I think he created several inflation czars. I mean, and we didn't label them czars. I mean, the media labeled them czars. We didn't classify them as czars. But my point is he creates these positions, or he gives somebody who's already in a position this title without any power or authority. And it's putting window dressing on an issue, trying to say, look, we're going to solve this by appointing this person the poverty czar or inflation czar, the drug czar. I mean, the drug czars actually began with Nixon. Everybody thinks the Reagan administration had the first drug czar. It was actually during the Nixon administration where you saw them popping up, and they did relatively little. And I think that's probably the most damning problem, not only for the president and his political capital, because, I mean, ultimately Nixon was seen as not doing much for inflation because there wasn't much he could do. It's more to the point that you're creating a expectation that the president can solve all ills, and even if the federal government can do that, it's not in the presidency where that's going to solely happen. And Congress has capitulated and ceded power to the president without thinking that it is a co-equal branch and that it can do something about these policy problems. Now, I'm not saying whether government should be doing that or not, but I mean, heck, if it's going to solve any policy issue, you can't just have one half of government deciding to sit on the sidelines, which is basically what Congress does with most of these major policy issues.
Can anyone demonstrate any tangible benefit we have received over 40 years of having drug czars? I think there are serious questions about whether any of these czar positions produce any positive, tangible results that government could not have produced without the creation of these positions. And I would go so far as to say that in some cases they cause administrative overlap, confusion of responsibilities and the usual accountability and democratic controls problems on top of those that I don't even see where there is significant utility to having these positions. I have a hard time pointing to any particular czar position that, wow, because of that position, something very good came about as a result that never would have happened had that position not been created.
Well, hold on. I will say a czar did effectively administer the Japanese relocation program during World War II. I don't mean to laugh about that, but if you think about it, I mean, Roosevelt appointed Eisenhower, well, not Dwight Eisenhower's brother, as the relocation czar. I mean, and everybody thinks that, oh, this is the Army's responsibility to do this, and they did an effective job. Well, the armed services were fighting a war at this time. They needed basic bureaucratic help for this. So what happened was Roosevelt set up a czar office in order to administer the relocation of Japanese Americans during World War II. I mean, it's one of the ones I'd like to highlight that shows that, look, you have this office that wasn't created by Congress, isn't accountable to Congress, and basically could do whatever it wants under, well, Congress did pass a few laws dealing with the relocation, but basically administrative orders either coming from the President's office, an executive order, or from the military general over the controlling the West Coast.
I wanted to briefly talk about here at the end because this is also has been significant. So the czar. Our concern about the czars seems to be rises during the Obama administration for a lot of reasons. You know, we have the issue of Van Jones, who was a special quality advisor for green jobs to President Obama, and he is removed from office after it's revealed that he, thought Bush knew about 9/11 in advance, and also, had been a member of communist organizations and made rather deplorable statements about his political opponents. But we also have Stephen Ratner, the car czar, and we also have Kenneth Feinberg, who was a dual czar. He was the pay czar to administer certain salary levels for executives for companies that received TARP funds, and also he became the claim czar under the impromptu fund that BP funded at the request of the Obama administration, and my understanding is he administered the payouts under that. But also we have the Bush administration using a lot of czars. And so how do the two administrations compare in that regard? And not just absolute numbers. Obama has appointed more, but how they've used them.
Well, Obama, I think, has much more aggressively used czars to engage in regulatory activity over the private sector. Think of the powers, for example, that Kenneth Feinberg has, or controlling policy areas. I think there has been a vast expansion in the roles that czars play in the Obama administration beyond what has been the practice in the past. Not that we think what happened in the past was very good either. But take Feinberg, for example, having the authority to regulate pay for executives of companies that received relief under the TARP fund, and then having a dual czar position, administering the claims from the BP Oil Fund. The White House wasn't even able to answer the question, where his salary was coming from, or where the money was coming from when asked in a press conference. And then ultimately it was revealed that, well, the money is coming from BP Oil, so a lot of people said, well, it's not the taxpayers' money, so why should we really care about this, that the president, in consultation with BP Oil, appointed a czar to determine how the claims money should be distributed. And a colleague of ours said, well, think about that. Let's say that the head of ExxonMobil wanted to cut a private deal with the president, give money to the executive branch, and in consultation with the president, they would decide how to distribute the money for this or that purpose, and they could just completely circumvent the legislative process by doing that. So we think that there are some very profound problems with the creations of these positions for democratic governance that need to be taken seriously. And there was a period last year and the year before, I think, where there was a lot of public debate about this issue, but it seems to have died down. and it's not much of an issue right now during this campaign, regrettably.
No, and I guess I think when we look at what happened with the auto bailouts and Stephen Ratner's role there, I mean, of course, it was a policy commitment made by the Obama administration. One could say it was going to happen regardless, and yet it seems to me the use of a czar in that role allowed some of the, or perhaps facilitated some of the more egregious things that occurred that have been documented by a lot of people afterwards, even though many people at the time were making these arguments. But then also with Kenneth Feinberg, it seems to me also the way the media covers it, we don't even get to these basic questions. I guess that shouldn't surprise us. I mean, no one, with the Feinberg, what I remember was really attempts to say he's not out for socialist justice, or he's not out for egalitarian justice. He is there to do a good job and to make sure that the people's funds are properly administered with regard to TARP. The basic question of where did he get his power, not even asked. It seems, I guess I maybe we should end with what's the way forward. Is there a way forward? I suppose one level there has to be a legislative solution, but yet that's not the most important thing. It seems it's a change in the types of questions we ask and the things we're concerned about.
Yeah, I agree. It's we can all focus on a legislative solution, and Congress could pass something tomorrow, and it's not going to change everything. It's not even probably going to change a small amount of it. I think it goes back to this fundamental understanding of what our government's all about. What is the basic understanding of checks and balances, separation of powers, a constitutional republic where people are ultimately the source of power. It gets funneled through our institutions of government, and they're supposed to share power, but at the same time check each other. And basically right now we have presidential-centered government, and until we have teachers in high schools, elementary schools, and even professors at colleges telling students, this isn't necessarily how you run a democracy, where you have presidential governance. And then the citizenry understands that and elect officials who believe in that. Because ultimately, members of Congress, they've bought in lockstep the idea of presidential governance. And you can't even get a law passed that would do anything without changing the people who can change the members of Congress to do something about it. Because we've tried that. 1978, the White House Authorization Act, it was supposed to bring about accountability. But what happened? The Carter administration decided to gut most of it through a conference committee discussion with members of Congress, basically saying, oh, trust us, we don't need reporting requirements here. We'll give them to you voluntarily. Members of Congress trusted the executive branch and the reporting, the willing reports by the future presidents hasn't occurred, and so it's going to be a long slog. I don't think you're going to see anything happen overnight, and it take a concerted effort not only by teachers, educators, but also outside organizations, just individual people to change people's mindsets. It's a grassroots movement.
Congress tried to defund existing czar positions, and in fact had such a provision in the budget bill that Congress and the President negotiated and that the President signed into law. But then the President did something else, which is indicative of the whole problem we're talking about today. He issued a signing statement that effectively excised a portion of a bill that he had just signed into law, thereby protecting the existing czar positions from being defunded. So we're stuck in a situation now where the President can pretty much do what he wants. Here the President used his authority that he claims that he has to, in effect, alter a section of legislation he just signed into law because he didn't like it. And that was the effort by Congress, again, to defund existing czar positions.
Gentlemen, thank you for being here. The book is The President's Czars, Undermining Congress and the Constitution. Professor Sollenberger and Professor Rozell, thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.